Welcome to the 75th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with thriller writer Tom Knox, the author of many thriller novels including The Lost Goddess, The Genesis Secret, The Marks of Cain, and others. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Tom Knox, author of the new thriller novel, The Lost Goddess. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, nice to speak to you.
Sure. Well, the listeners haven't heard about your new novel, The Lost Goddess, yet. Can you describe what the novel is all about?
Yep, there's kind of two strands to the plot. One is set in France, in the great Ice Age caves of France, Paleolithic caves like Chauvet and Lascaux, where they're amazing Ice Age paintings, and some very strange skulls that really were discovered in those caves. A lot of my books are based on the truth, and these very strange skulls with these strange wounds were discovered in the 19th century. And the other half of the book is set in Indochina, in Cambodia and Thailand and the tiny little kingdom of Laos. And they kind of focus on the history of communism, in the terrible history of communism in those countries, in particular in Cambodia.
Great. Well, I know that some of the inspiration for The Lost Goddess came from your own travels in Cambodia and Laos. As someone traveling to these countries, as you know, obviously somewhat of an outsider, I'm curious, what fascinated you about the people and the cultures of those two countries?
You mean Cambodia and Thailand?
Right.
Those two countries.
Right.
Well, for start, they're so different. The Thais are a kind of go-ahead, capitalist, quite energetic yet affable people, and with a monarchy they love, and despite what you hear, a fairly stable society. Cambodia is a much more troubled place, and in some ways, therefore, perhaps more interesting. It has a history of black magic and strange witchcraft, and it has this truly appalling history of the communist regime in Cambodia. And people forget this. I mean, it's amazing that people don't remember that this was probably the worst regime as such in the history of human society. The Khmer Rouge murdered 2 million of their own people. That's probably 30% of the entire population of the country. They killed their own people. And my book tries to explore how such a demonic regime could arise. I find it a fascinating part of the world.
Wow. Well, your novel combines both historical discoveries, as you mentioned earlier, in France, but it also discusses genetic experiments. And obviously, you've done your research into genetics and genetic experimentation. What do you think that kind of that most people don't realize about kind of what's going on in genetics today that's not necessarily in the headlines?
Well, I mean, yeah, my book goes into the past and quite menacing history of genetics, but also looks slightly ahead towards the future and what we might be able to do to the human mind and to the human genome, given the science we are now uncovering. For instance, we may in the future discover that we can genetically make it impossible for people to be homosexual. How would we feel about that? I have plenty of gay friends who would be outraged at that idea, but it may become possible, and we could give parents that opportunity to say your child will definitely not be gay. So huge moral dilemmas are going to arise in the future, as they have arisen already in the past, as my book investigates.
Right. Well, I'm curious about your kind of path to publication and your success as a writer. You've prior to The Lost Goddess, you had two best-selling novels, The Genesis Secret and The Marks of Cain. In terms of your own personal history, did you always want to write, or what drove you to sit down and write your first thriller, or is it something you've always wanted to do?
It's probably genetic. My dad is a writer, so I think I'm a living example of the validity of genetic science. And my dad's a writer. I saw also maybe a bit of nature and nurture. I saw him writing as well, so that was an example. But also, I remember writing when I was a kid. I was 4 years old. I would write stories in like exercise books, so I've always wanted to tell a story. And the great thing about thrillers that I've discovered later in my writing life is that you can really tell a story. You can really get into a traditional narrative. And the story is really all that counts. The plot, the story, driving that on. And I love telling a story.
And so what was it like for you when you originally wrote the Genesis Secret? Did you when you finished it, what was the process like for you getting that thriller published?
It was fantastic. I got really rich. I made loads. Before that, I'd written these very sensitive literary fiction, these novels that get nice reviews and don't sell many copies. And I was a bit bored of being poor. And the Genesis Secret sold in 25 countries, and it made a lot of money, and it was very gratifying. It wasn't just the money; it was the readers. Suddenly I had hundreds of thousands of readers around the world emailing me, and as a writer, that's the best possible feedback. It's just people you'd never met saying, "I loved your book," or even "I hated it," but interested enough to email you out of the blue from Jakarta or Kenya. I loved that. That Genesis Secret was a revelation, and a wondrous thing for me.
So what was the difference for you like? You mentioned earlier you alluded to more literary novels. From that to your experience of writing the Genesis Secret, I imagine the process was somewhat different.
It is. I mean, literary fiction is in a way its own genre. It's the sort of novels that get prizes. But if you're writing a thriller, you've got to focus. You have to construct the plot first. You've got to really nail down that plot. It's the scaffolding, it's the superstructure, it's the blueprint. And without that, there is no novel, there is no thriller. And that was a learning process for me, that first thriller, is to realize how important it was to get each chapter exactly in place before I even began. Since then I've written more thrillers and I've learned on the job. But I hadn't really grasped how difficult it was to get a plot exactly right. But it is absolutely vital, as I now know.
And what is that process like for you on kind of a nuts and bolt level? Do you it sounds like from what you just described that you do a lot of extensive outlining before you even start writing the story. Is that the case?
That's absolutely the case. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating for me to realize how, as I say, I've learned on the job. I feel like somebody was told to I don't know, build a cathedral and was given a few stones at first. You've got no idea. You gradually learn by yourself. And yes,
can you stop for a moment?
And I will actually spend more time on that than I will actually. Sure.
Actually, I was just going to say, could you stop for a moment and just repeat what you just said, because you broke up? Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
Do you want to repeat the question, then I'll give you an answer?
Yeah, sure. So I'm just curious. From what you just said, it sounds like you do extensive outlining before you start working on writing the story. Is that the case for you?
Absolutely, yeah. As I've learned again on the job, I've realised how important it is to get the outlining and the plotting exactly right. I like to read about this, about how other writers have approached this. The other day I read about P.G. Wodehouse. And you read P.G. Wodehouse's comedies and you think, oh, he must have written that in a week. But no, he would spend 3 months plotting a book before he even began writing it. And then the writing would take 3 weeks. It was the plotting that he found the hardest part. But once he got that right, then the rest of it would flow. And I find the same thing. I'm not P.G. Wodehouse by any means, but I totally understand where he's coming from. Once you've got the framework in place, the rest of it is just like colouring in.
Right. Well, what are you working on now? Are you writing another thriller?
I certainly am. I'm here in Thailand. It's midnight. I've been writing all day. I'm writing a new thriller called Resurrection, which is set partly in Egypt and partly in a place called Cornwall in England, which is a very remote, quite poetic part of England where I come from. It's the first time I've ever used it in a book. So I'm using a bit of my own family background and also the amazing history and present situation of Egypt, which I visited recently during the revolution, where it was pretty startling.
And so, given what you've learned as you've described in writing thrillers, especially compared to kind of your earlier kind of literary novels that you mentioned, what tips or advice would you offer for aspiring writers who are wanting to write commercial fiction or thrillers or mysteries? It's
going to be slightly boring advice. It is get that. Sorry, but it's the obvious answer. Is have a great idea and then build a good story. Don't just sit down and think, because you can write. Don't think, as I did, because you can write a nice sentence, you can therefore write a nice book. That's not true. You've really got to think about that plot. You've got to get it. You've got to nail it to the ground, kill it, really get it, stamp on it, make it flatten it totally. And then once you've got that sorted, then you can build your cathedral. But you need the blueprint first. And you need that good idea. You do need an idea that it not only inspires readers, but inspires you. Every time you sit down at the desk, you've got to think, this is a good idea. Get a great idea. That's my easy advice.
That's great. Well, where can people find out more about you online?
I've got a website, tomknoxbooks.com. I've got an ever-growing Wikipedia entry, Tom Knox, brackets, author, close brackets. So, yeah, I think if you Google my name, you'll find me online.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Tom Knox, author of the new thriller, The Lost Goddess, and it's available in bookstores now. Is there anything that we didn't cover, Tom, that you would like to talk about?
No, I think I'll draw a veil of discretion over the rest, if I could.
Okay. Well, thanks for doing the interview.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to my latest podcast. If you have a chance, please leave a review of the podcast in iTunes. It only takes a moment. Until next time, read some good books and be well.
Almost 90% of women have cellulite. And guess what? It's not their fault. We don't choose cellulite, but we can choose a different way to treat it. Meet Quo, collagenase Clostridium histolyticum, AAES, the first and only FDA-approved prescription injectable for moderate to severe cellulite in the buttocks of adult women. This non-surgical treatment is injected by an aesthetic specialist in 10 minutes or less. Individual results may vary. Do not receive if you are allergic to any collagenase or ingredients in Quo, or have an infection at the treatment site. May cause serious side effects, allergic reactions including anaphylaxis, and injection site bruising. Seek medical help right away for any signs of allergic hypersensitivity. Tell your doctor about all your medical conditions if you have a bleeding condition or take medicine that prevents clotting. Most common side effects include bruising, pain, hardness, itching, redness, discoloration, swelling, and warmth at the injection site. Ask your doctor about all possible side effects and for product information. If you're ready to get to the bottom of your cellulite, learn more and find a specialist at Quo.com.